So the time period of 1883 through 1925 is known as the Golden Age of newspapers. This is the time period where newspaper owners held the monopoly over all news in America. National news was either published through their pages, or it wasn't published at all. These monopolies centralized the editorial power and made people like Pulitzer and Hearst tremendously powerful. However, since then, and over the subsequent half-century, the extensive power of newspapers eroded substantially. We've seen declining circulation numbers for papers, and the substitution of radio and TV as people's primary news source, as well as more recently the internet. Newspapers have less and less of an ability to shape the agenda and reach people. At the end of the golden age of newspapers, starting in 1920, Westinghouse launched the nation's first commercial radio station. It's KDKA in the media capital of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They initially had little to do with civic affairs, and their news briefs actually largely acted as an advertisement for newspapers. They'd do a brief cut-in with a news story, give the reader a teaser, and then would say, check out the Pittsburgh Daily Bugle for the whole story, or whatever the Pittsburgh newspaper was at the time. At some point, someone finally realized that they were driving people away from their source. So radio stations started to do news themselves and take those advertising dollars away from the papers to keep for themselves. Newspapers tried to respond, but ultimately failed in their attempts, making radio the preeminent source of news. Television technology comes around shortly after this in the 1930s, but the TV industry doesn't become huge until after World War II. We had a huge manufacturing push as factories went back into manufacturing commercial goods instead of goods for the war, leading TVs to become omnipresent by about 1960 or so. We began to see things like the famous Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960, and by the end of the decade, we'd see broadcast television dominate the news landscape. As we go on, cable and satellite emerge as competitors, ending the landscape dominated by only a few networks and their news, and then the creation of 24-hour cable news networks like CNN, Fox News, and then MSNBC. However, as is the case with most technologies, lawmakers had to quickly anticipate new problems coming up and figure out solutions to some of our big collective action problems. The first problem was congestion of the airwaves. There are a limited amount of radio frequencies on which people can broadcast, and if people start broadcasting on finer and finer frequencies, then no one will ever be able to find a spot. I don't know how many of you actually experienced this, but back in the night, we had something called a dial on the radio. What you would do is literally take a dial and turn it back and forth to try to find a radio station. You had to try and figure out where 92.3 was on the console that had lines at 92 and 93, and had to fine-tune a narrower and narrower space to get that perfect signal. This was tough enough with stations only on odd-numbered tenths of a decimal point. Imagine how difficult it would be if you went to all tenths, or even hundredths. Clearly, there was potential tragedy of the commons getting ready to happen with too many stations making it so no one can exist and make a profit in the marketplace. So, government needed to create licenses for these stations handed out by the government. The Communications Act of 1934 established the idea that the government owns the airwaves and licenses stations provided that they act in the public interest. We also began to see some other political regulations trying to define what the public interest looks like and how different stations should act. A few quick examples: equal time rules prevented broadcasters from favoring one candidate over another with free or easier access to the airwaves. The goal here being democratic accountability of the media rather than cheerleading. The Fairness Doctrine sought to assure that different points of view on controversial issues had access to the airwaves. Currently, the law also limits a company's ownership to somewhere around 40% of the national television audience. This, at least in theory, prevents the Hearst-Pulitzer monopolies from reemerging. However, we still see a situation where a small handful of companies own the vast majority of media resources. Think about how much money you have to buy a television station, and then how much money it takes to make it work. Someone like Oprah struggles with that, and she's, a billionaire several times over. It's not as if poor people, even middle-class people, are having access to the airwaves in the way that, millionaires and billionaires do. However, a lot of these restrictions have been made moot by the internet. The expansion of access for blogs and comment sections have a democratizing effect on the media. We're also seeing the expansion of newspapers into the internet, trying to find ways to renew profit streams that have dried up in the broadcast area. Places like the New York Times and Washington Post offer you free access to their website or unlimited access to their website if you pay them $1 a month or a couple dollars a month. The goal being, hopefully, then you will pay for their product rather than just consuming it on the internet for free. The newest innovation in internet journalism is what we call explanatory journalism. Sites run by people like Ezra Klein, Nate Silver, and the New York Times vertical The Upshot don't necessarily do traditional reporting, but instead focus on data-driven approaches to explaining events that happen in politics on a regular basis. Applications, or apps as I like to call them, have made it easier to consume news, and have helped newspapers regain some footing in the game while simultaneously consolidating from different newspapers in every city to a few major sources dominating the landscape.